Good afternoon. Thank you for attending the League of Oregon Cities 2020 conference. I'm Brad Bingenheimer, Assurance Partner with Bolt Carlisle and Smith, Certified Public Accountants. My fellow partners and myself are pleased to sponsor this session on a very important and timely topic. Having an open and honest discussion about race is vital to our communities moving forward in a positive direction. I am pleased to introduce our speaker for this session today, Sean Palmer. Thank you.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this session, Better Talk About Race. Our speaker for this session is Sean Palmer, a teaching pastor at Ecclesia Houston, one of America's most innovative and vibrant multi-site churches, serving a predominance of millennials and young adults. Previously profiled in Christian Standard magazine as one of 40 leaders under 40, and with 21 years of ministry experience, Sean is a sought-after national keynote speaker, teacher, writer, and workshop facilitator. His writing has been featured on Scott McKnight's Jesus Creed, Sojourners, FoxNews.com, The Lookout Magazine, and Christian Standard Magazine. Sean, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to you now.
Thank you, Patty. I'm excited to be here today and spend some time with all of you from my home in Houston, Texas. And I know right now, a lot of us are used to spending a lot of time at home, that we've been home for a long time. As a matter of fact, I'm looking forward to this day. I work with a brilliant group of creatives, of storytellers. And at one of the campuses, one of the locations where we like to shoot, we had set everything up for our time today with the right cameras. They're high-end and 4K and lighting. And we spent hours and hours getting it just right. But one of the things that happens that you actually kind of get used to if you live in Houston is that during this time of year, we get a lot of storms. And every year we get more and more and more storms. And last night, a huge tropical storm rolled through and is still rolling through very slowly. And Houston, if you've ever been here or ever lived here, have family or friends who are here, floods. And so the word came down from on high, which is the mayor's office and the county judge, that no one should go out if they don't have to. So we're here in my home. Like many of you, I'm here with my spouse, with my children, all of us using up acres and acres and acres of bandwidth every moment of the day, trying to get the things done in life. And I'm reminded just in this moment that one of the key things to living well and leading well is to take life and deal with life as it comes, responding to the world as it is. And now, probably unlike any time in my lifetime, we need thoughtful women and men who are able to respond to the world as it is, not as we want it to be or as we imagine it to be, but as it is. Some of you have heard the quote that a leader's first responsibility is to define reality. And I think right now what we need leaders to do is to be deeply in touch with reality as it is in order to help people move forward, regardless of the sphere of influence that we inhabit, regardless of the places where we work. That if we deal with things that actually are not real, are imagined, are fake, then we never get to root causes and root problems. So I want to spend a little bit of time today talking to you about how you might deal with some of the more tense and hard places where we find ourselves. And this has been a lifelong work for me, both inside of my full-time vocation and the work I do outside of it with training leaders and speakers and business executives and local governments on how to deal with really tense, really divergent issues. But my story actually starts well before my birth. I want to introduce you to someone who means a great deal to me in my story. And this is a man named Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was a civil rights leader in the late 1950s and the early 60s in Jackson, Mississippi, where I was born in 1974. Medgar Evers fought in a war, came back to his home state of Mississippi, and realized that he had been fighting for a country, in his view, that did not treat him as they treated the other soldiers that he fought alongside, and that he was fighting for things, that he was sacrificing for things, sacrificing for ideals that weren't afforded to him when he returned home. So he became a school teacher and a local leader in the Jackson, Mississippi NAACP. Well, one night, on June 12, 1963, Medgar Evers was called to an emergency meeting of the local NAACP there in Jackson. And it was a late meeting. And the reason it was a late meeting and the reason it was an emergency meeting is because earlier that night, the president at the time, John Kennedy, had given a national speech on race relations. And the local NAACP really wanted to think through how they were going to respond to what the president had said. And after that meeting, Medgar Evers went home. He pulled into his driveway, got out of his car, and walked around to the back of his car, to the trunk, and opened it, and inside was a box of t-shirts. And inside that box of t-shirts, inside that box with those t-shirts, emblazoned on each shirt were the words, "Jim Crow must go." As Medgar Evers was lifting that box of t-shirts out of his trunk, he was shot in the back with a bullet from an M1917 Enfield rifle. Well, his wife heard the shot. Every light in the house comes on. She races outside, scoops up her husband, loads him in the car, and races him to the local hospital. When they get there, Medgar Evers is denied entrance into that hospital because they served whites only. It was only after they realized who he was, that he was a local civil rights leader, that they decided to admit him to the hospital. But by that time, it was too late. 45 minutes after Medgar Evers was shot in his driveway, he died. And the reason that story's always been important to me is because my father was Medgar Evers' paperboy. My father lived in a different part of Jackson, Mississippi, and every day he would get on the school bus and ride to school, take a different bus to go to another part of town, to go to the newspaper headquarters, grab up his satchel of newspapers and throw them in Medgar Evers' neighborhood. And what my dad tells me about that story is that the day after Medgar Evers was shot, no one knew. It wasn't like now where there's kind of wall-to-wall news. We weren't living in a time where people knew everything that was going on 5 or 10 minutes after it happened, if even that long. There was no Twitter, there was no Facebook, there's no 24-hour news cycle. But when my dad got to the Evers house, it wasn't as if there was an investigation going on. There was none of that yellow tape that police put out to secure the crime scene. Just nothing, except a little stain of blood. And that launched my family in a new trajectory, in that my parents really wanted to inhabit a world where they were treated as everyone else, that they weren't really free until they were. And they set me and my brother on that same trajectory to be the kind of people who shaped the world in particular ways, not simply to make it better for us, but better for all people. My father went into education, eventually became a high school principal, and then ended his career in the superintendent's office. And what he used to tell me as a boy is that wherever you are, you have the ability to shape the world, to look out and see places where there is injustice, where there's unfairness, where there's inequality, and wrap your arms around it in such a way that you leave the people and the places that you touch in better shape than when you found them. And what I'm mindful of at this particular moment in history is that though Medgar Evers was killed in 1963, that our world really isn't all that different. There have definitely been some advances in the last few decades. In the last 50 years, things are so much better in so many ways, from medicine to relationships, to the way people care for children, to the way we care for our world. But there's still a lot of road ahead of us. And so as a teenager, I had a particular gift, at least I had a particular interest in words. I love to read, I love to write. And my dad told me, quoting someone, that words actually do create worlds. And the words that we use and the way we use those words have the ability to shape both our realities and the realities around us. And as people who are called into positions of leadership, of aid, to be really careful about the words we use. Because absent those words, we lose the ability to connect with one another on a deeply human level. We also lose the ability to move forward agendas that will serve the common good. When we lose words, we actually do lose one another. So one of my good friends is a philosopher by training, and he teaches philosophy. And I love having conversations with him because he repeatedly asks the same questions of his conversation partners. When someone says something, he responds, "What do you mean by that?" Because words can mean a lot of different things, and we mean different ideas when we say different words. And we need to have crystal clear clarity around what we mean when we say certain things. Because what happens is then we assume that we know what another person means. That this happens all of the time in our interpersonal relationships. Someone that you're dating, maybe one of your children, someone that you work with says something, and you have this inner turmoil about it. You get angry, or you're frustrated or disappointed. And then it turns out later, when you circle back around to them a little bit later, that that's not what they meant at all. And their intention was very different from what you heard. But in between that time, what has happened is that we've lost one another, and we've lost the ability to aid and help one another. So several years ago, I was part of a community service organization. And part of the rhythm of life in that little town where I lived at the time was that one Wednesday a month, we would gather for lunch. And there would always be a presenter at the end of lunch kind of talking us through what was happening in their segment of the community. And we looked forward to those times. As a very gregarious group. They like to talk and like to eat together. We'd gather, have a meal together, connect with one another, hear what's happening in people's lives, and not only their work. But I had been out of town and raced back on Wednesday morning to get back to this lunch. It was that important to me. And when I walked in about 10 minutes late, I noticed that no one was talking. It was almost as if there was a cone of silence that had descended down over the meeting. And it was only hushed tones, people asking for the bare minimum of what they needed. Pass me the salt, can you hand me the ketchup? And I didn't know what was going on. And then it dawned on me that this wasn't any Wednesday. This was the Wednesday after the Tuesday of the last presidential election. I had early voted because I knew I was going to be out of town. And what I realized in that moment is that no one is talking because we don't know what to say to one another. We don't know who is safe for us to say something to. And in that room, there were people who were absolutely elated over the election. And there were other people who were absolutely distraught. And no one knew who was who or how to talk to one another. And we lost one another. We hadn't been taught, given the tools to communicate about our differences, about our disappointments, about our joys, and to be able to hold those in a way that honored one another, but also helped us move forward. And I left that day thinking, I don't know what's going to become of this group of people, this extraordinary group of leaders. Because if we can't talk to one another, no one in our city is going to be able to talk to one another. And what's happened is what I feared would happen. In that very same town, just this last year, there was an officer-involved shooting, killing of an unarmed African-American male. Now, I recently visited with the mayor, and he doesn't know what to do because the people that he would normally call upon to help walk him through, to help the city walk through, well, they stopped talking. And their absence of words has created a kind of chasm in the city that they can't cross. And so after that meeting, I left thinking someone's going to have to do something about that. I'm going to have to figure out what to do, how to help us navigate these waters. And I came across a book that was recommended to me by a man named Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Now, given my particular social location as someone who works both with local city entities and in the religious sector, I found this incredibly, incredibly insightful. And what Haidt says in the book is that if you are a conservative person, or if you're a liberal person, that you fundamentally think differently than the other side. And what he's trying to do is bridge the gap that tells us if someone disagrees with us, if someone has a different perspective, a different point of view, then they're evil. That there actually are reasons that people arrive at these positions, and those reasons aren't flippant. It's not that people are brainwashed. It's not that we're not thinking through things. It's not that we're evil. It's that we do really inhabit completely different worlds. And those worlds give rise to why we think the way we think and why we do so much of what we do. And so Haidt comes at it and says, you know, we're all here. We're all stuck here. So let's figure this out. If we're going to move together organizationally, if we're going to move together as cities, as states, as nations, then we're going to have to figure out a way to talk to each other and not talk down to one another. And so he identifies 5 channels that all of us think, 5 ways of moral reasoning. Those ways of moral reasoning are harm, fairness, authority, in-group, and purity. That all of us are reasoning. Whatever position we hold, how do we arrive at it? We are reasoning from harm, fairness, authority, in-group, and purity. And so they have devised a test to give to people all across America and all across the world to see how you kind of fundamentally reason morally. And what they found is that it always comes down to these 5. And there are things that we don't ever think about that shape our reasoning. So if I were to say to you, for instance, is it good to burn an American flag? Well, most people I know would say that it's not good to burn an American flag. And what conjures in their mind are people running onto baseball fields or at protests, burning an American flag in protest. But do you know what is the proper way to dispose of an American flag once it's become tattered, once it's become useless? The proper way to dispose of it is to burn it. You don't throw them flags into the trash can. You burn them. And yet that image alone conjures feelings inside us. Why? Why do we think the way we think? So in all of the tests that they've given, this is what they've come up with. That if you are a liberal person, either religiously or politically, you rank harm and fairness extraordinarily high. In terms of your moral reasoning, what you're fundamentally basing your ideas on is whether it's harmful to other people or whether it's fair. Now, if you are a more conservative person, what's more important to you are authority, in-group, and purity. So just think for a moment about all of the things that are taxing the people around you right now. Think about the arguments that are being made politically, socially. What are those about? Harm, fairness, authority, in-group, and purity. Now, the good news is, I guess you could call it good news, if you're a conservative person, you're using all 5 channels of moral reasoning. If you are a more liberal person, you have such a high regard for harm and fairness that shapes everything that you think. And I think when we sit across the table from someone and they were to make an argument saying that something is about harm to others and fairness, that we would all be sympathetic to that. So think about issues around immigration, around policing, issues around tax code. Those are never about the things they're about. They're about harm, fairness, authority, in-group, and purity. The issue is never the issue. And so what Haidt says is that the righteous mind is really about creating and building us into teams. So he says what happens is the righteous mind unites us into teams. Good, bad, smart, dumb, good, evil, conservative, liberal. Then it divides us against the other team. And it blinds us to the truth. And that truth is that other people who disagree with us have something good and valuable to say and to offer. So one of my favorite quotes from the book says, morality binds and blinds. It binds us into ideological teams that fight each other as though the fate of the world depended on our side winning each battle. It blinds us to the fact that each team is composed of good people who have something important to say. So this is what Haidt says and how it comes back to us. He says the righteous mind, this tendency within us to use these 5 channels of moral reasoning and then to use them over and against other people, blinds us to other people's words, that they have something important to say. And when we lose our words, we lose each other. And so I've seen this really starkly in the last few months regarding the work that I do with groups and organizations around racial justice. And part of the difficulty of talking about racial justice in our moment in history is that it's hard to know sometimes what people are talking about, what they mean. And so what I want to spend a few minutes doing is walking us through some of the language that we use around race and what those mean. And I don't want this to become the kind of thing where everyone feels like they have to drill down and get the exact definition, but I want you to see how difficult these conversations can sometimes be when we don't understand what words mean. So first of all, let's just start talking about race. Race is actually not a scientific category, but we use it as a shorthand. In truth, there's only one race, and that's the human race. But race is typically, when we say it, a group of people who have physical similarities. Racism, then, is the belief that one race or group of people is better than the other group of people who share the same physical similarities. And what we have found is that throughout history, the group that looks the most the same are American whites. So within that group, those are the folks who look the same, who are closest approximation to each other. So the old joke, like the people would say, well, they all look alike. Well, that's really about American Caucasians. Other language that we use a lot, structural racism, is a set of unfair and unequal systems at the foundation of America. That is to say that you could take all of the racists out of a system and there would still be racism in the system itself. One of the easier ways to think about this and comprehend this is around housing. Things like Levitt towns and sundown towns here in the South where I was raised, that you have to be out by sundown. The way that education dollars are distributed. When my father was a high school principal in Mississippi, his schools, which were typically predominantly Black, were incredibly underfunded compared to the predominantly white schools that were oftentimes less than 4 or 5 miles away, and you could walk through the school and tell. And this wasn't in the 50s or the 60s, this was in the late 80s and the early 90s. Bias is having a preference for a group of certain people, which everyone has bias. Oppression then is long, unfair, painful, unjust treatment of a group of people. That you see folks being treated unfairly over time or by the system itself. White privilege, which is probably the most contested term in the racial justice space right now. And what's important to know about white privilege is that it's not the belief that white people just have had it easier, that they didn't work, that they haven't had to do things, that things were handed down. And I know it's really easy to hear that when you hear the word white privilege. But white privilege is about access on the basis of skin color, or it's about that whatever difficulties that a person experienced in their life, that their race wasn't part of the reason, wasn't a functional part of the reason why they experience. It just means that white people have not been systematically denied access. And so you can go back and look at how banking and housing is done. When my family bought our first home, when my wife is Caucasian, she actually applied for the loan because we knew that there were still places in the system that would make it either harder for me to secure the loan as the primary, or it would increase the interest rate. That's white privilege. White fragility is basically the upset that occurs in whites when we talk about issues around race. That's what it means. It doesn't mean that white people are fundamentally broken in some sense, that they are fragile in every sense, but it just doesn't take a whole lot to get white Americans upset over race, which typically leads to a desire to shut down that conversation altogether. White supremacy, that white people are better. I think we are all acquainted with that definition. There's overt white supremacy and covert white supremacy. Some is outward and some it's what I would just call sneaky. And so knowing the difference, and when someone says something is white supremacist, lots of people say, well, no, it's not, because they're looking for overt white supremacy. And this is what I call the 42 fallacy. So I know many of you have seen the movie 42. It's about Jackie Robinson and integrating Major League Baseball. And when the movie was in the theaters, people kept telling me over and over and over again, you gotta see 42, you gotta see 42, you gotta see 42. And when I finally went to see it, I understood why they wanted me to see it and why it was mostly my white friends who wanted me to see it. And that's because in the movie 42, all of the racism is isolated to individuals and individual acts, which is mostly what we think of when we think of something being racist or someone being racist, that racism is an individual person somewhere who does a racist thing, which is true, but that's only overt, and there's also covert. We also need to talk about microaggressions, small everyday actions. My daughters both have long curly hair, and they have been asked more times than I can count over the course of their life by someone if they can touch their hair. Worse though, is that oftentimes people just touch their hair. And that's a microaggression. Justice, fair and equal treatment for all people, no matter who they are. People of color is a term we're hearing more, and that's really an all-encompassing term for everyone who is not white. And then anti-racism, which means making choices and speaking words that show your stance against racism and encourage people to be treated the same way, no matter how they look. Assimilationist is a person who advocates for policies based on other groups assimilating to the dominant racial group. So Ibram Kendi, who many of you will recognize that name, says to be an anti-racist is to think nothing is behaviorally wrong or right, inferior or superior with any racial groups. Whenever the anti-racist sees individuals behaving positively or negatively, the anti-racist sees exactly that, individuals behaving positively or negatively, not representatives of whole races. To be anti-racist is to deracialize behavior, to remove a tattooed stereotype from every racialized body. Behavior is something humans do, not races do. And so what makes conversation difficult? Even if you had all of the right words and you agreed on all of the right definitions, why do we have difficulty having hard conversations? Why do we avoid them? Why do we let our own fear or fragility step in and take over when things are at the highest level of stakes? And that's because each one of us is what sociologists call a cognitive miser. We're all cognitive misers. And here's what it means to be a cognitive miser. Life is really hard. Your life is hard. You've got a job. Some of us have spouses. Some of us have children. It's 2020 and everybody is on overload from just about everything. And thinking uses calories. And your brain wants to take the night off whenever it can. It's trying to serve you. So here's what happens. Every time you move to a new city, start a new job, walk into a room, every room that you've ever walked into, every group that you've ever joined, you've done the same thing. That our brains start to mentally scan the group for the people in the group who look like or seem the most like us. Because getting to know people who are separate, who are very different from us, well, that takes work. And so what happens is that we end up living in these little silos We have these friends on social media, and we're in this group. And that silo tends to look a lot like us, tends to think a lot like us, doesn't challenge our presuppositions. We're cognitive misers. We don't want to spend the energy that it takes to talk to people who it might be hard to talk to. And so after I'd gone on this little journey with my group of civic leaders there in our small town, trying to figure out why we couldn't talk to each other, I realized the reason we couldn't talk to each other is because we had never talked to each other. We had only thought we talked to each other. And so we began to think through what it would look like to talk to people in a way that we could actually hear them and they would be free to speak. And so we started with the ideas around listening with empathy. That when we talk to people, that we would see the world as others see it, not as we imagine it to be. That we would free ourselves from judgment about what they said. Judgment negates other people's experiences and protects us from pain. That's why we don't do it. That's why we save those calories. We also decided that we must be in touch with our own feelings in order to understand someone's world. If someone says something that it upsets me, that I need to deal with whatever it is in me that is upset, and not to just project my upset on them being wrong or ignorant or evil. And listening with empathy also means that we respond by telling people that I've been there, that we understand, rather than, oh, it could have been worse. Or, my group lost the last election, so we'll all live through it. Or my group won the last election, and I am entitled to have it that way again. One of the great gifts of my life is that a woman named Brene Brown, and the great thing about being in Houston, I'll just share this with you if you keep a secret. Brene's husband has been our pediatrician since our girls were born, and we just love it. And Brene says, we have to listen to understand in the same way we want to be understood. So we invited this little group of people to break into smaller groups on a regular basis, not in our meeting times, but separate times. We said, we want you to have people in your homes. And identify people in your organization, around the community, and who are the people in that organization and community who are the least like you. The people that cognitively you wouldn't want to spend the energy on because they are so different. So if you're younger, maybe someone who is older. If you are part of the dominant culture here, maybe you find someone who is on the margins, an African American or a Hispanic, someone from our Latino community. If you are gay, find someone who is straight. If you're a straight person, find someone part of our LGBTQ plus community. And have them over for dinner, not in some third space, not at a restaurant, but in your home. And we want to encourage you to do two things. To ask a good question about their experience, about their lives, and be quiet. To extend the space between stimulus and response. To ask someone what life is like in their community, what their experience has been in their community, and to let them tell it without response. And then, if they say something that you disagree with, that you get kind of puffed up or bowed up over, that you want to respond to, that you want to go all caps on them, to not do that and to simply say, tell me more. Tell me more about your experience, about your thinking. How did you arrive there? And what we saw is that people began to not only listen to each other, but to talk, to really delve into their own life story. And even when folks left those gatherings, still disagreeing with what someone had said, everyone had felt seen and heard. And what we've seen over that time is that that community has begun to heal, and they have taken those skills outside of that group into the rest of the community. And this is how we have better talk. We have better talk by learning to listen. And we live in a talking society. But we're striving for improvement is to create a listening society. And so I hope that's helpful. I have found that learning to listen and share the actual contents of my life and to hear the actual contents of the lives of people that I am connected with as we work and partner together to bring about a beloved community is the only and best way forward. Thank you. Appreciate your time.